Okay, so let us fix a video about the economy of ancient Rome.
Ancient Rome was perhaps the most significant ancient civilization to have existed throughout history. The empire lived.
Okay, first of all, you have the Hittites, you have the Egyptians, you have a plethora of Levant civilizations. And then you have, of course, Persia, Persia, Persia. Persia, Persia, Persia. Also became Parthia, also became Armenia, also became the Ottoman Empire. Byzantina Empire at one point was basically what Persia was mostly, etc., etc., etc. So upholding Rome as if it's this some shining thing is ridiculous. Okay, you also have China as a far more complete, long-lasting civilization from start to finish than anything in the West has ever done.
For over 1,000 years.
I mean, 1,000 years is nothing to a Chinese dynasty. I mean, that's pretty much a bunch of them lasted longer than that. However, I would argue Rome lasted way longer than 1,000 years. It lasted about 1,500 years. Because I would argue that basically he's ignoring the fact that he's ending it at 500 AD. 500 BCE to 500 AD. And that completely ignores the Byzantine Empire, which then became the Ottoman Empire, which only ended basically at World War One. So this is just utter rubbish so far.
And in that time, it gave us the foundations for our modern society: democracy, a court-based legal system, Latin languages and the alphabet, three-course meals, and
The only thing that drives me nuts about the Australian accent is the part that always makes it sound like you're always asking a question at the end. Three-course meals?
perhaps it was one of the
Perhaps?
first modern economies to move beyond
The first modern economy to move past?
a simple agrarian empire.
That's not true. Okay, I mean, in what world was Egypt considered an agrarian empire just because it was so rich in wheat? It moved past, it did trade. The Minoans were definitely not an agrarian civilization. What about the Minoans? The Minoans predate Rome by like 1,500 years. The Aksumite Empire, what about that? That was in Ethiopia. That predates Rome. I can keep going on.
And
on.
develop things like modern
And on.
banking, lending, tax.
Rome never created modern banking. There's nothing about. Prove to me Rome created modern banking. What are you even on about?
Taxation, and yes, even financial crises as we know them today. In the same way that scholars will study a dead language like Latin to discern the foundations of meaning in modern dialect.
Sure, there were booms and bust cycles, but they were mostly. Most of Rome's boom and bust cycles pretty much depended on famine and whether or not a specific military incursion brought back money. That was about it to its boom and bust. It had nothing to do with banking or finances as we really, really know it. Unless you go, like, probably you could argue after Augustus the Great, you might have had 100-year period, we could do that, but most of that was still about the emperor just throwing money around crazily and bankrupting the empire. So you just had a lone dictator basically running finances amok, which is not like what's going on today.
Rome to determine basic economic functions in a time before modern finance.
Time? Before? Modern? It just always sounds like time? Before? Modern? Like you're always asking a question with this accent.
Financial systems could skew results.
And it's not all the Australian accents, it's just apparently one region that does this. But I don't know, I don't fancy it just because it also sounds like the Bali accent in LA. That always sounds like they're always asking questions Like, totally? Forever? Shaw?
Rome was perhaps the most developed case study that we could look at.
No, Persia. Or, actually, sorry, I apologize. China. Period, the end. China is the most developed case study you could ever look at. I mean, you could probably argue that there was probably some level of banking and finances that you see the foundations of the modern era in China. Yeah, it's a joke that he's using Rome, okay? China is just so much farther above as a complete empire.
And the entire ancient world was extremely poor.
I mean, China basically has been inconsistent. Different people overthrew and took over, but there's a way to argue that possibly you could literally argue, unless you really look at the Mongols, that China has had like a 4,000 year period where basically you just have like reoccurring dynasties boom up and crash back down within itself. If you exclude the Mongols. If you include the Mongols, I would consider that a vastly distinct culture from China that randomly like took over it. Well, the horse people of the steppes.
Our minds are cast to scenes from Gladiator with huge spectacles and emperors and nobility draped in untold riches. But the reality, over more than 1,000 years, hundreds of rulers, and even...
Once again, I would claim that Rome did not end until the 19th century, which puts it at what, like 2,400 years from start to finish?
Even capital cities moved around more than...
But even if you go back, no one does the date of 500. They do basically the date that the Byzantine Empire lost Constantinople to the Ottomans, is when everyone claims Rome died, but they just basically became what Byzantines were, except for the Turks just basically fused their horse culture with the Byzantine Empire and then started borrowing from other cultures around the area, and they just fused it, which is just all Rome ever did. It was just borrow from other cultures. I mean, the only thing you could claim that they really did was the aqueducts and the roads.
Once, so exploring the economy of ancient Rome would be like exploring the economy of the United States and assuming that Jamestown was being developed at the same time high-frequency trading was taking place in New York, which is, of course, very, very silly. So instead, it is important to understand that Rome and its economy as an evolving system that...
We have no idea how advanced the other cultures were around Rome. Okay, to compare the Celtic cultures as like Jamestown in its entirety is just nonsensical in and of itself. They were very advanced. I mean, the Celts in Gaul had better metallurgy technology than Rome by the time they took them over. And basically, Rome only gathered that technology by enslaving a third of the Celts that were in Gaul. And the same thing in Britannia, okay? They might have not had advanced stoneworking buildings, but to then like look at Rome as not like some cesspool where like people lived in clustered little like brick and wood buildings that constantly caught on fire and like their feces were thrown out windows half the time is just silly. I mean, they had public restrooms and public baths, but you still had nasty things going on in the poor areas that didn't have access to any of that.
That grew and declined
Mass
the same
ghettos.
way that any other economy is destined to today. So with that out of the way, let's start with the fun stuff that is central to any functioning economy.
Rome actually basically they basically controlled the food supply, and so sure, they taxed an aspect of that, but the biggest wealth typically from Rome was actually plunder. Like, they were imperialistic, they went out, they stole wealth. So taxes were not how Rome generated its mass income. It was usually going out there and plundering, like pirates.
Benjamin Franklin famously said that there is no guarantee in life apart from death and taxes. And perhaps this tongue-in-cheek expression did not take into account the many societies that have existed throughout history without direct taxation But that's a story for another time. What does matter is that one of the central drivers of Rome's success.
I don't know, maybe it's just me, maybe other people like the Valley accent that always act. It's just. The inflection, I don't know. I always felt like the inflection of the question, where you always make it slightly higher at the end just for a question in the English, was a good thing. So whenever you remove that, it's hard to know if someone's asking a question or making a statement. So that's the reason why personally it's driving me nuts, because you have to like really like concentrate on this guy to make sure that he's asking a question.
And longevity was the skill that they employed in levying taxes. Today, taxes are something that we take for granted, but even in our modern world filled with automated record keeping, electronic banking, and instant communication, levying taxes is extremely difficult. It takes the work of huge government organisations.
But it doesn't have to. That's the other thing. The government could send you a thing that claims what it feels you owe taxes, and only like business owners and people who like run basically farms and the wealthy would basically have more advanced. If you were just doing a hourly job where you work and get paid, you could have literally a thing that would say, we think you owe this much in taxes. Or they would literally withhold X amount, and then they would say, we're going to give you this much money. If you want to prove that you should get more, then send us in these forms, type of a thing. And then you would basically only do taxes if you disagreed with like whatever your refund would be that year.
Thousands of workers to effectively process things, and even then, mistakes and oversights are made. Now, partially, this is probably due to how many different types of taxes we have.
And maybe the problem is, I don't know, maybe it's taxes in Australia, but he's doing a lot of US-looking places
liquor
to be
taxes,
talking about
import
this.
taxes, candy tax. The list is pretty exhaustive. But at the beginning of Rome's reign, they alleviated a lot of this difficulty by focusing on one select type of tax, which was actually one of the only types of taxes to not exist in most modern nations today. And that is a wealth tax. At the start of the empire, the nation was little more than a small spit of land on the Italian peninsula.
The wealth tax was just taxing like the grain when it first started. I mean, basically, landowners that produced X amount of food they were agrarian at the start. They were incredibly agrarian. I mean, you couldn't argue that Rome was not an agrarian society up until they defeated Carthage. That was a completely trade-based society. And if you wanted to talk about finances and trade in that region, you should first focus on Carthage, because anything Rome did, they did worse than Carthage in that regard. There was no empire that traded during that time period better in at least this region of the world than Carthage. It's nothing. You're taking apples to oranges, trying to argue Rome was great with finances.
Centered around what would go on to be the city of Rome. Because of this relatively small size and because they lacked any alternatives, Rome was able to levy taxes from the wealth of its citizens. The people
Once again, Rome's wealth came primarily from plundering.
That were worth taxing were predominantly.
And this is it, dude. They taxed grain. They did a grain tax. I don't know what he's on about, okay? So, I mean, you're more than welcome. This person does do good videos. And I don't really hate to fully bash his accent, except for the fact that it makes it hard to always know if he's like making a statement or if he's doing a question. But you can go here. This is the video, okay? And a lot of his videos are really, really good. But this one is just atrocious because it completely ignores like so many empires. It basically acts like there was nothing going on in the world until Rome became anything. Which I get is what Western history teaches you, but it's utter garbage. If you want to go to the culture that is more advanced and long-lasting, it's China, period, the end. Thank you. Take care. God bless. Bye.